The clock on the wall showed 10 minutes past 7 when Rachel wiped down her fifth table of the evening. Her feet ached in the cheap black flats she'd bought from a discount store 3 months ago, but she couldn't afford new ones yet. Not with rent due in a week and her student loan payment sitting in her inbox like a ticking time bomb. Working at the Belmont wasn't what she'd imagined doing at 24. 6 years ago, she'd been accepted into one of the country's top music schools with dreams of becoming a concert pianist. But life has a way of rewriting your story whether you like it or not. Her father's heart attack came during her second year. The medical bills piled up faster than snow in a blizzard. Someone had to work, and her younger brother was still in high school. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She'd promised herself it would be temporary. Just a year, maybe 2, but temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. Now here she was, balancing plates of food that cost more than her weekly paycheck, smiling at customers who didn't see her as a person, just part of the restaurant's expensive ambiance. The Belmont catered to the kind of people who drove cars that cost more than houses. Every night, Rachel watched them walk through those heavy oak doors like they owned the world. Maybe they did. They certainly acted like it. They snapped their fingers for service, sent back perfectly good meals because the garnish wasn't arranged right, and left tips that seemed generous until you realized they'd just spent more on wine than Rachel made in a month. Tonight was supposed to be busy, but nothing prepared her for the commotion that started around 7:30. The manager, Stephen, rushed through the dining room with the kind of nervous energy usually reserved for health inspections. The staff whispered in the kitchen about a VIP reservation in the private dining room. Someone important, someone wealthy. Someone who could make or break the restaurant's reputation with a single review. Rachel had heard it all before. Rich people loved feeling important, and restaurants loved making them feel that way. She focused on her section, refilling water glasses and taking orders, trying not to think about the piano gathering dust in her tiny apartment. She used to play every day. Now she was lucky if she touched the keys once a week, and even then her fingers felt stiff and unfamiliar. The private dining room at the Belmont was reserved for special occasions. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Crystal chandeliers caught the candlelight and scattered it across walls decorated with paintings that probably cost more than Rachel would earn in her lifetime. And in the corner, mostly ignored by everyone, sat a beautiful grand piano. It was a Steinway, kept perfectly tuned even though hardly anyone ever played it. Rachel had asked about it once during her first week. Stephen told her it belonged to the original owner's wife who'd been a pianist. Now it was just another expensive decoration. Around 8 o'clock, Stephen pulled Rachel aside. His forehead was sweaty despite the air conditioning, and he kept adjusting his tie like it was strangling him. "I need you to handle the private dining room tonight," he said, speaking quickly. "Jennifer called in sick, and you're the only one I trust not to mess this up." Rachel's stomach dropped. The private dining room meant bigger tips, sure, but it also meant more pressure. More chances to make a mistake that could cost her this job. And she needed this job desperately. "Who is it?" she asked. Stephen lowered his voice even though they were alone in the hallway. "Daniel Westbrook. The tech guy. You know, the one who's always in the news?" Rachel knew the name. Everyone did. Daniel Westbrook had built a software company from nothing and sold it for billions before he turned 30. Now he invested in startups, sat on corporate boards, and apparently liked making headlines almost as much as he liked making money. The business magazines called him a genius. The gossip sites called him difficult. The truth was probably somewhere in between. "He's here with potential investors," Stephen continued. "Big meeting. Everything needs to be perfect. Understand?" Rachel nodded, smoothing down her uniform and checking her reflection in a decorative mirror. She looked tired. The concealer she'd applied that morning had worn off hours ago, leaving dark circles under her eyes visible. Nothing she could do about it now. She pushed open the door to the private dining room and immediately felt the temperature change. Not literally, but the atmosphere was different. Heavier. 6 people sat around the large table, all dressed in suits that probably cost more than Rachel's car. They were talking in low voices about market shares and quarterly projections. The kind of conversation that made her feel like she was listening to a foreign language. At the head of the table sat Daniel Westbrook. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe in his mid-30s with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. He glanced up when she entered, and for just a second his gaze locked with hers. It wasn't friendly or unfriendly. It was assessing, like he was trying to figure out something about her in that brief moment. "Good evening," Rachel said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start by offering you our wine selection?" For the next hour, everything went smoothly. She took orders, delivered courses, refilled glasses, and stayed invisible the way good waitstaff are supposed to. The conversation at the table ebbed and flowed around topics she barely understood. Venture capital, market disruption, something about artificial intelligence that sounded like science fiction. She was clearing the appetizer plates when Daniel spoke directly to her for the first time. "Your hands," he said suddenly, interrupting a conversation about stock options. Rachel froze, plates balanced carefully in her grip. "Excuse me?" He gestured toward her fingers. "You play piano, it wasn't a question." Rachel looked down at her hands, at the calluses on her fingertips that even months of reduced practice hadn't completely erased. Most people never noticed them. Most people never really looked at her at all. "I used to," she said carefully, unsure where this was going. "Not so much anymore." Daniel leaned back in his chair, and suddenly everyone at the table was looking at her. The weight of their attention felt physical, pressing against her chest. He gestured toward the piano in the corner. "Play something." Rachel's heart started beating faster. "I'm working." "I can't just—" "I'll make it worth your time," Daniel interrupted. He pulled out his wallet and placed several crisp $100 bills on the table. "Play through dinner. If my guests enjoy it, there's $5,000 in it for you." The room went quiet. $5,000. Rachel's mind raced through what that money could mean. 3 months of rent. Her loan payment with money left over. New shoes. Maybe even a few piano lessons to shake off the rust. But something about the way Daniel was looking at her made her hesitate. This wasn't a generous offer. It was a test. A challenge. The kind of game rich people played when they got bored. Across the room, through the small window in the door, she could see Stephen watching nervously. He gave her a small nod. "Do it. Don't mess this up." Rachel set down the plates and walked toward the piano, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She hadn't performed in front of people in 3 years. Her fingers felt stiff and uncertain as she lifted the fallboard. The keys gleamed under the chandelier light, perfectly clean, barely touched. She sat down on the bench, took a deep breath, and began to play. Rachel's fingers touched the keys, and muscle memory took over. She started with something safe, something she could play in her sleep. A Chopin nocturne. It was beautiful, elegant, the kind of piece that belonged in fancy restaurants as background music. Her fingers moved through the familiar patterns while her mind stayed somewhere else entirely, watching herself from a distance. The notes floated through the room, soft and pleasant. She kept her eyes on the keys, not wanting to see the faces watching her. This was fine. She could do this. Just background music while they ate their expensive food and talked about their expensive lives. After a few minutes, Daniel's voice cut through the music. "Stop." Rachel's hands froze mid-phrase. Her heart jumped into her throat. Had she made a mistake? She looked up to find him staring at her with those sharp, calculating eyes. "That's lovely," he said. And somehow it didn't sound like a compliment. Very professional, very safe. "But I didn't ask for elevator music. Play something with some backbone. Rachmaninoff. The Second Concerto, if you know it." Rachel felt her face flush. Of course she knew it. Every serious piano student knew Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. It was one of the most famous pieces ever written. It was also incredibly difficult, requiring not just technical skill but physical stamina. The kind of piece you had to practice every day to keep sharp. She hadn't practiced it in 2 years. "That piece requires an orchestra," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can play the piano part but without the rest." "Then play the piano part," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. Or is $5,000 not enough motivation? One of the other guests, an older woman in a navy suit, looked uncomfortable. "Daniel, maybe we should just let her play what she's comfortable with." "It sounds nice." "Nice isn't memorable," Daniel said without looking away from Rachel. "Nice is forgettable. I want to see what she can really do." Rachel wanted to walk out. She wanted to tell this arrogant man that she wasn't a trained monkey performing for his amusement. But $5,000 sat on the table like a dare, and Stephen was probably having a heart attack watching through the door, and her rent was due in a week. She turned back to the piano and began the opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. Her fingers stumbled slightly on the first few chords. They were big chords requiring her hands to stretch across multiple keys, and her muscles weren't warmed up. But she pushed through, feeling the piece come back to her slowly, like remembering a dream. The music was powerful, romantic, filled with sweeping melodies that demanded emotion. She could feel her shoulders tensing with the effort, her back starting to ache from the intensity. This wasn't background music. This was the kind of piece that demanded attention. When she finished the section she remembered best, Daniel was already calling out another request. Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, then another. Debussy, Clair de Lune, and another. Prokofiev, something energetic. It became clear that this wasn't just about the music. Daniel was testing her, pushing her to see where she would break. Each piece he requested was more demanding than the last. The other guests had stopped talking entirely, their business dinner forgotten as they watched this strange performance unfold. Rachel's arms began to ache. She'd played for nearly 2 hours straight with only brief pauses between pieces. Her fingers, soft from months of irregular practice, started to hurt. A blister was forming on her right thumb. But every time she finished a piece, Daniel would request another before she could even catch her breath. The older woman spoke up again. "Daniel, she's been playing for quite a while. Maybe she needs a break." "She can take a break when she earns it," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving Rachel. "One more. Play something fast, something that shows technical skill." Rachel chose a piece by Chopin, one of the more difficult etudes. Her fingers flew across the keys, but there was no joy in it. She was just executing notes, proving a point. The music was technically correct, but emotionally empty. She was too tired, too frustrated, too aware of being watched and judged. When she finished, she kept her hands on the keys, breathing hard. Her shirt was sticking to her back with sweat despite the air conditioning. Through the corner of her eye, she saw Stephen peek through the door window, his face pale with worry. The guests had finished their main course. Dessert plates sat untouched. They weren't here for dinner anymore. They were here to watch whatever strange power game Daniel was playing. "You know what's interesting?" Daniel said, swirling the wine in his glass. "You're technically excellent. Your timing is perfect. You hit every note exactly right. But you're playing like a computer. Like someone who memorized all the right answers without understanding the questions." Rachel felt something crack inside her chest. She turned on the bench to face him directly, forgetting for a moment that he was a customer, that she needed this job, that she couldn't afford to lose her temper. "Maybe that's because I'm exhausted," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Maybe that's because I've been on my feet since noon, and I'm playing a piano I've never touched before, and I'm doing it while 6 strangers stare at me like I'm some kind of performing animal." The room went completely silent. One of the men coughed nervously. Stephen was probably dying behind that door. Rachel waited for Daniel to explode, to demand she be fired, to storm out and leave a scathing review that would ruin the restaurant. Instead, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one of genuine interest, like she'd finally done something unexpected. "There it is," he said quietly. "That's the first real thing you've said all night. The first hint that there's an actual person sitting at that piano instead of just a well-trained performer." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "One more song. But this time I don't want technical perfection. I don't want something you learned in school or practiced 1,000 times. Play something that actually means something to you. Play something real." Rachel's throat felt tight. Something real? When was the last time she'd played something real? When was the last time she'd played anything except to prove she still could? To convince herself she hadn't completely wasted 6 years of training. Her hands were shaking slightly as she turned back to the piano. The keys looked different now, less like a test and more like a question. What did she have left that was real? What piece of herself could she share with these strangers who saw her as entertainment? The dining room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Everyone was waiting. Stephen was waiting. Daniel was waiting with that challenging look in his eyes. But more than that, Rachel realized she was waiting too. Waiting to see if she had anything left inside her worth sharing. Waiting to see if 3 years of just surviving had completely erased the part of her that used to feel the music instead of just playing it. She closed her eyes and let her hands hover over the keys. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a melody stirred, something she'd almost forgotten, something she'd written herself a long time ago, back when she still believed in dreams. Rachel sat frozen at the piano bench, her hands trembling above the keys. Daniel's words echoed in her head. Play something real. But what did that even mean anymore? She'd spent 3 years trying not to feel too much, not to think too hard about what she'd given up. Feeling things hurt. Remembering hurt worse. Her mind drifted back to a different time. She was 21, sitting in a cramped practice room at music school with rain hammering against the windows. Her phone kept buzzing with calls from the hospital. Her father had been there for 2 weeks. The doctor said things were stable, but stable didn't mean better. It just meant the crisis was happening in slow motion instead of all at once. She'd started writing a piece that night. Not for a class, not for a grade, just because the emotions had to go somewhere, and her chest felt too small to hold them all. The melody had come easily, like it had been waiting inside her all along. She called it the space between because that's where she was living. Between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. Between hope and grief. Between staying and leaving. She'd only played it once at a small student recital 3 weeks before she dropped out. Then she'd packed it away with all her other unfinished dreams. Now, sitting in this expensive restaurant in her waitress uniform, Rachel made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would play that piece, not because Daniel demanded something real, but because suddenly she needed to remember what real felt like. Her fingers found the first notes almost by accident, soft, tentative, like testing whether it was safe to speak. The melody was simple at first, just a single line in the treble clef. But there was something vulnerable about its simplicity, something honest. The left hand joined in with a gentle rhythm that didn't quite match the right. It stuttered and hesitated, like a heartbeat that couldn't decide if it wanted to speed up or slow down. Rachel had written it that way on purpose, trying to capture the feeling of sitting in a hospital waiting room, watching the clock and willing time to move differently. She wasn't thinking about technique anymore, wasn't worrying about hitting the right notes or keeping perfect time. Her hands moved across the keys with a freedom she'd almost forgotten existed. The music swelled, growing more complex, more urgent. The melody climbed higher, reaching for something just out of grasp. In the dining room, something shifted. The older woman who'd defended Rachel earlier leaned forward in her chair, her wine glass forgotten. One of the men stopped checking his phone. Even Daniel's expression changed, the calculating sharpness softening into something harder to read. Rachel played through the difficult middle section where the two hands seemed to fight each other. She'd written it during the worst week when the medical bills started arriving, and she realized no amount of hoping would make the numbers make sense. The music captured that feeling of being pulled in 2 directions, of wanting to be 2 people at once, the daughter who stayed and the musician who couldn't afford to. Her eyes stung with tears she hadn't cried in months. Years, maybe. She'd gotten so good at pushing feelings down, at staying practical and focused on the next shift, the next bill, the next day. But the music was dragging everything back to the surface, whether she wanted it there or not. A staff member opened the door, probably to check on something, but stopped in the doorway. Through her peripheral vision, Rachel saw Stephen standing there too, his earlier anxiety replaced by something like wonder. Other servers had gathered behind them. The sounds from the main dining room had quieted. People were listening. The piece moved into its climax where both hands came together in a series of crashing chords that Rachel had always thought of as anger. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, exhausting kind that comes from fighting battles you know you can't win, from watching dreams slip away one practical decision at a time. She made mistakes. Her fingers stumbled on a particularly difficult passage. She lost her place for half a second and had to find her way back to the melody. But somehow the imperfections made it more honest, more human. This wasn't a polished performance. It was 3 years of grief and frustration and stubborn hope pouring out through her fingertips. The older woman had tears running down her face. She wasn't trying to hide them or wipe them away. She just sat there letting them fall, completely absorbed in the music. The man next to her had stopped pretending to look professional. His jaw was tight like he was fighting his own emotions. Rachel transitioned into the final section. This was the part she'd struggled with the most when writing it. How do you end a piece about being stuck in between? She'd eventually settled on a resolution that wasn't quite happy or sad. The melody simplified, came back to something closer to the beginning, but changed somehow. Worn down maybe, or worn smooth. The left hand settled into a steady, quiet rhythm. Not the irregular heartbeat anymore, but something calmer, more accepting. The last notes faded into silence, and Rachel lifted her hands from the keys. She sat perfectly still, staring at her own trembling fingers. Her face was wet. When had she started crying? She couldn't remember. The silence in the room felt alive, heavy with something Rachel couldn't name. She was almost afraid to turn around, to face the people who just witnessed her falling apart at a piano while wearing a waitress uniform. This wasn't what she'd signed up for tonight. This wasn't professional or appropriate or any of the things she was supposed to be. Then someone started clapping. It was Daniel, standing at the head of the table, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly everyone was standing, clapping, and the staff members in the doorway joined in. Rachel finally turned on the bench. Her face felt hot, her eyes swollen. She probably looked terrible. Definitely not like someone who deserved $5,000 for a performance full of mistakes and messy emotions. Daniel walked toward the piano. For once, he didn't look like he was calculating an angle or testing a theory. He just looked at her with something that might have been respect. "What was that called?" he asked quietly, even though the applause was still going. "The space between," Rachel managed to say. Her voice came out rough and thick. "I wrote it. A long time ago." "You wrote it," Daniel repeated, like that information changed something fundamental. He pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly. "That's interesting. That changes things." Rachel had no idea what he meant. She was too emotionally exhausted to figure it out. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, probably smearing her makeup everywhere, and tried to pull herself together. The older woman approached, holding out a business card with shaking hands. "My daughter runs a music foundation," she said softly. "Please call her, please." Rachel took the card, not really processing what it meant. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life instead of living her own. Daniel was still on his phone, making call after call. She heard fragments of conversation, studio time recording, original compositions. None of it made sense. She was just a waitress who'd played one song, one messy, imperfect song that she'd written when she was too young to know better. But looking around the room at the faces still watching her, Rachel realized something had shifted. She'd spent 3 years trying to play it safe, to survive without feeling too much, and in one song she'd broken that pattern completely. Now she had no idea what came next. Rachel stood in the bathroom 10 minutes later, splashing cold water on her face and trying to understand what had just happened. Her reflection looked back at her with red eyes and smudged mascara. She looked like she'd been crying for hours instead of playing piano. Maybe there wasn't much difference. The business card from the older woman sat on the edge of the sink. Patricia Chen, director of the Horizon Music Foundation. Rachel had heard of them. They gave grants to young musicians, funded small concerts, supported composers, the kind of organization she used to dream about when she still believed in dreams. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. "Rachel, you okay in there?" It was Stephen, sounding worried and confused and maybe a little bit angry. She couldn't blame him. She'd just had an emotional breakdown in front of the restaurant's most important customer. That probably wasn't in the employee handbook. She opened the door. Stephen stood there looking like he'd aged 5 years in the last hour. "What on earth just happened out there?" "I don't know," Rachel said honestly. "He asked me to play something real and I did, and now I think I might be fired." "Fired?" Stephen laughed, but it sounded slightly hysterical. "Are you kidding?" "Daniel Westbrook just left a tip that's probably more than I make in a month, and he wants to talk to you before he leaves. He's waiting in the lobby." Rachel's stomach did a flip. Why would he want to talk to me? "I have no idea. But when a billionaire says he wants to talk, you talk. Go, I'll handle your tables." Her legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the lobby. The main dining room had mostly cleared out. A few customers lingered over coffee, and she caught some of them staring at her. Word had apparently spread about the performance in the private dining room. Great, just what she needed. More attention. Daniel was standing by the windows looking out at the city lights. He'd loosened his tie and he looked tired in a way that made him seem more human and less like a photograph from a business magazine. "You wanted to see me?" Rachel said, keeping a safe distance. He turned around. "I made some calls. I have a friend who owns a recording studio downtown. He owes me a favor. I've arranged for you to record that piece you played tonight. Professional quality. Tomorrow afternoon if you're available." Rachel blinked. "I don't understand. Which part?" "Any of it." "Why would you do that?" Daniel studied her for a moment. Do you know why I asked you to play tonight? It wasn't just to be cruel, though I'm sure it felt that way. I have this theory that you can tell everything about a person by how they relate to music. Most people fake it. They go through the motions, hit the right notes, but there's nothing underneath. No truth, no risk. He walked closer. You played it safe for 2 hours. Perfect technique, zero soul. I was ready to write you off as another talented person too afraid to be interesting. But then you played that last piece and everything changed. You stopped performing and started communicating. That's rare. Rarer than you think. Rachel didn't know what to say. Part of her was still angry at him for pushing her. Part of her was grateful. The emotions tangled together in a way that made no sense. The recording session is scheduled for 2 o'clock tomorrow, Daniel continued. My driver will pick you up. Bring any other original pieces you've written. The studio's yours for 4 hours. I can't afford. It's already paid for. Consider it part of the tip. Rachel's mind was racing. I work tomorrow. Double shift. I can't just. I spoke to your manager. He's giving you the day off. Of course he did. Because apparently when you were rich enough, you could just rearrange other people's lives without asking. Rachel felt a surge of irritation cut through her confusion. You can't just decide these things for me, she said. I appreciate the offer, I really do, but you don't get to control my schedule because you liked one song. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're right. I'm sorry. I got carried away. The offer stands, but it's your choice. The studio's booked either way. Show up or don't. He pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. It was heavy. Your tip. As promised, Rachel opened it. Inside were neat stacks of $100 bills. She quickly counted. $5,000, just like he'd said. Her hands started shaking again. This was more money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. There's actually $50,000 there, Daniel said casually, like he was talking about $50. The extra is an investment. In your music. Use it however you want. Pay off debt, buy a better piano, take time off work to compose. Your call. Rachel's vision blurred. This couldn't be real. People didn't just hand out $50,000 to waitresses who played one song. I can't accept this. Why not? Because I didn't earn it. I played one piece. One piece that wasn't even that good. It was better than good. It was honest. And in my experience, honesty is worth more than perfection. Daniel checked his watch. I have to go. My driver's information is in the envelope. 2 o'clock tomorrow at Riverside Studios. Think about it. He started to walk away, then paused. One more thing. Stop hiding. Whatever made you quit music school, whatever convinced you that serving food was safer than playing piano, let it go. The world has enough mediocre musicians playing it safe. We need more people willing to fall apart at a piano in front of strangers. Then he was gone, walking out into the night with his expensive coat and his casual confidence that everything would work out, because it always did for people like him. Rachel stood alone in the lobby, holding an envelope full of more money than she'd ever imagined having, and tried to remember how to breathe. Stephen appeared at her elbow. So? What did he say? He wants me to record my music tomorrow at a professional studio. Stephen whistled low. Are you going to do it? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I don't know. She walked back to the private dining room to collect her things. The piano sat in the corner, innocent and quiet, like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. In the space of 3 hours, Rachel's carefully controlled life had cracked wide open, and she had no idea how to put it back together. The business card was still in her pocket. Patricia Chen. The envelope full of cash felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Tomorrow there was a recording studio waiting. All of it felt like a dream, the kind where you wake up and feel disappointed that none of it was real. But her fingers were sore from playing. Her eyes were still puffy from crying. Her body ached with the kind of exhaustion that came from holding nothing back. Those things were real. Whatever happened next, at least tonight, had been real. She sat down at the piano one more time and played a single chord. It rang out clear and true in the empty room, hanging in the air like a question that didn't need an answer yet. Rachel lifted her hands, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the door. Tomorrow she would have to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. But tonight, she just needed to get home and try to process the fact that her life had changed in ways she still couldn't fully understand. The space between who she was and who she might become had suddenly grown a lot wider, and for the first time in 3 years, That didn't feel quite as terrifying as it should have. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat on her apartment floor with the envelope of money spread out in front of her, like evidence from a crime scene. $50,000. She kept counting it, convinced she'd made a mistake, but the number stayed the same. This was enough to change everything. Or ruin everything. She wasn't sure which scared her more. At 1 in the morning, she called her younger brother. He answered on the 4th ring, groggy and confused. "Rachel, what's wrong? Is Dad okay?" "Dad's fine. I'm fine. Something happened tonight and I don't know what to do." She told him the whole story. The billionaire, the challenge, the song she'd written years ago. The money. The recording studio waiting for her in 12 hours. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "So let me get this straight," her brother finally said. "A rich guy heard you play piano and now wants to give you everything you walked away from 3 years ago?" "It's not that simple, isn't it though? Rachel, you gave up music school for us. For Dad's medical bills. You've been working yourself to death at that restaurant because you thought that's what you had to do. But maybe this is the universe telling you it's okay to want something for yourself again." Rachel wiped her eyes. She hadn't realized she was crying. What if I fail? What if I go to that studio and nothing good comes out? What if this is just some rich guy's weird hobby and tomorrow he forgets I exist? Then you'll still have $50,000 in the memory of the night you fell apart at a piano and everyone cried. That's more than most people get. Her brother yawned. "Go to the studio, Rachel. Play your music. You've earned it." After they hung up, Rachel dug through her closet until she found the old binder, her compositions from music school. Most were half-finished, scribbled on staff paper with notes in the margins. Ideas she'd never had time to develop. Dreams in musical notation. She pulled out her keyboard, the cheap electric one she'd bought at a pawn shop because she couldn't afford to move her real piano from her parents' house. It wasn't the same as playing on a grand piano, but her fingers found the keys anyway. She started playing through her old pieces, remembering why she'd written each one. A melody about her mother's garden. A complicated rhythm inspired by the subway at rush hour. A sad, slow piece she'd composed after her first heartbreak. By the time the sun came up, Rachel had made her decision. She was going to that studio. The driver arrived exactly at 1:30. The car was the kind with leather seats that probably cost more than Rachel's rent. She felt ridiculous climbing into it wearing her nicest jeans and a sweater she'd gotten on sale 2 years ago. But the driver treated her like she belonged there, and that helped somehow. Riverside Studios was in a part of the city Rachel rarely visited. The building looked ordinary from the outside, but the lobby was full of gold records on the walls. Famous names she recognized from the radio. Bands that had played in stadiums. And now she was here, a waitress with a binder full of half-finished songs. A woman with bright purple hair met her at the desk. "You must be Rachel. I'm Alex. Daniel told me to expect you. Studio B is all set up and ready to go." Studio B was bigger than Rachel's entire apartment. A beautiful grand piano sat in the middle, surrounded by microphones and equipment she didn't recognize. Through a window, she could see the control room where Alex was setting up. "Take your time getting comfortable." Alex's voice came through speakers. "We've got 4 hours, but we can go longer if you need it." "No pressure. Just play whatever feels right." Rachel sat at the piano and immediately knew it was the best instrument she'd ever touched. The keys responded to the lightest pressure. The sound was rich and full, filling the room like honey. This was what a real piano was supposed to feel like. She started with The Space Between, the piece from last night. Without an audience watching, without the pressure of Daniel's challenge, it felt different. Calmer somehow. She could hear things she'd missed before. Places where the melody could be stronger. Moments that needed to breathe more. Then she moved on to her other pieces. The unfinished ones. She played them straight through, mistakes and all, letting Alex record everything. Some of them were terrible. Some surprised her with how good they still sounded after years of neglect. Around the 3-hour mark, something shifted. Rachel started improvising, building on the melodies she'd written years ago. Her fingers found new patterns, new ways of expressing old ideas. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam, and she stopped trying to control it. She just played. When she finally stopped, her hands were shaking and her back ached, and she felt more exhausted than she'd ever been in her life. But it was a good exhaustion. The kind that came from actually doing something instead of just surviving another day. Alex came out of the control room with a smile so big it looked like it might crack her face. That was incredible. Seriously. I've worked with a lot of musicians, and what you just did, that was special. Over the next week, things moved faster than Rachel could process. Alex edited the recordings and sent them to Daniel. Daniel sent them to someone in the music industry who sent them to someone else. Patricia Chen from the foundation called and invited Rachel to perform at a small showcase for emerging composers. 20 people in a gallery space. Nothing fancy. But it was a start. Rachel kept working at the restaurant. She needed the stability, the routine, something to hold on to while her life spun in directions she'd never planned. But she also started playing piano every night, working on her compositions, slowly letting herself believe this might be real. 3 months later, a music producer reached out. She'd heard Rachel's recordings and wanted to talk about making an album, an actual album of original compositions. The advance wasn't huge, but it was enough for Rachel to cut back her hours at the restaurant. Enough to breathe a little. 6 months after that night at the Belmont, Rachel played a concert at a small downtown venue. 200 people showed up. Daniel was there, sitting in the back row instead of demanding a VIP seat. Patricia Chen came with her daughter. Even Stephen from the restaurant showed up with some of the other servers. Rachel played the space between last. Before she started, she told the audience the story. About being a waitress. About a billionaire who pushed her until she broke. About remembering why she'd loved music in the first place. When she finished, the applause washed over her like a wave. But the best moment came after, when a young woman approached her nervously. "I'm a music student," the woman said. "I've been thinking about dropping out because it's so expensive and I don't think I'm good enough. But hearing your story, hearing your music, maybe I won't give up just yet." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. This was why it mattered. Not the money or the recognition or the chance to record albums, but this, the possibility that her music might give someone else permission to keep trying. 2 years after that February night, Rachel performed at a much bigger venue. The program included The Space Between, now considered one of her signature pieces. Critics called her an important new voice in contemporary classical music. Students studied her compositions in music school, but Rachel's favorite moment was still that night at the Belmont. The night she'd been pushed past her breaking point and found something real on the other side. The night she'd played like everything depended on it, because in a way everything had. She still had the envelope Daniel had given her. She'd spent most of the money on practical things like debt and a better piano, but she'd kept the envelope itself with his note inside. For the space between where you are and where you should be. She'd crossed that space. And on the other side, she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for all along, not fame or fortune or validation from strangers. Just the simple, profound joy of playing music that mattered, of being brave enough to fall apart in front of people and trusting that somehow the pieces would come back together in a shape worth sharing. The piano in her apartment wasn't fancy. It wasn't a Steinway grand, but it was hers, and every night she sat down and played, remembering the lessons she'd learned that changed everything. Sometimes the only way forward is to stop playing it safe and start playing from the heart.